5 and he was 6. We rode on horses made of sticks. He wore black and I wore white. He would always win the fight. Bang, bang, he shot me down. Bang, bang, I hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, my baby shot me down. Seasons came and changed the time. When I grew up I called him mine. He would always laugh and say, remember when we used to play? Bang, bang, I shot you down. Bang, bang, you hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, I used to shoot you down. Music played and people sang. Just for me the church bells rang. Now he's gone, I don't know why. And till this day sometimes I cry. He didn't even say goodbye. He didn't take the time to lie. Bang, bang, he shot me down. Bang, bang, I hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, my baby shot me down.
Hello folks, welcome to another video in the 172nd Air Wing channel. Please click the like and subscribe button if you haven't taken the time to do so already. That lets me know that you guys like the comments and the content that I'm putting out. It also helps you get notified when I add new videos. I'm looking to release a new video just about every Tuesday at this point. So at this juncture, I would expect that you guys would probably get notifications for new videos around about that time. So if you're looking to know when I do release a new video, or if there's something that suddenly comes up, like maybe a comment from an industry leader such as HobbyMaster or Caliber Wings, I may do a sudden video on that, in which case, if you're subscribed, you'll know when I do that. So thank you again for your time and coming into the video, even if you are too cool to click that subscribe button. And let's get right to the subject at hand, which is the A-10C. This one is in the colors of the 47th Fighter Squadron with the HobbyMaster model number of HA1324. The A-10 came into service in 1977 after quite a bit of political wrangling in the Pentagon. You see, the story starts, ironically enough, with an Army project. The U.S. Army was looking to create the HA1324 Cheyenne helicopter. Now, the Cheyenne was meant to be a close air support Army dedicated ground attack helicopter, and this was developed because the Army perceived the Air Force to be somewhat in default, if you want to use that phrase, on their agreement with the Army, along the Key West Agreement is what it's called, stating that the Air Force would maintain a close air support mission in exchange for the Army giving up access to fixed-wing aircraft. The Army had viewed that the Air Force had not held up their end of the bargain, so they went to develop the Cheyenne. Now, in the cost of the time, the Cheyenne promised to be so expensive that it was going to cost as much per helicopter as the same year F-4E Phantom II. So that's kind of a crazy thought when you think about it. You know, the idea of a tactical helicopter costing as much as a frontline at that time cutting edge fighter jet. I mean, picture how ridiculous it would be if the Army came out and said they wanted a helicopter that cost as much as an F-22. Probably some of you would probably be dying of laughter at the very thought of that notion, but the Army tried it. And the Air Force, not wanting their budget to be cut to fund such an expensive helicopter, burned the midnight oil to make sure that the Army's program was dead before it ever got in front of the leadership of the military. Now, to make that happen, Colonel Avery Kay of the U.S. Air Force was tasked to develop the A-10 and to make it as viable and as destructive and as cheap as possible. You see, unlike just about every other Pentagon program, cost was an important factor here because the Air Force needed to beat the Army. And in order to beat the Army, the A-10 had to be substantially less expensive than the Cheyenne. So in the way of realizing this goal, Colonel Avery Kay made sure to reuse a lot of off-the-shelf components. Much of the parts, like the landing gear, were taken from existing U.S. military airplanes. The engines, two of which you see right here, one there and one there, they're actually the same General Electric engines as are used on the popular and very frequently used Canada Air / Bombardier Canada Air CRJ regional airliners. So if you've ever flown a regional airliner in the United States in probably the last 20 years, you've been on an airplane that uses the same engines as the A-10. So this, of course, helps keep the cost substantially lower than your typical F-22, F-15, F-16, F-35 kind of project. So because the costs were kept so low, so many of these practical off-the-shelf technological components and the lack of a radar and advanced avionics, this led to a lower per aircraft cost for the A-10 than the Army's Cheyenne project. This resulted in the Cheyenne being canceled and the Air Force being able to rest easy on their budget being cut. Now, this pretty much terminated the interest on the project by the senior levels of the Air Force, because to understand that, we have to go into a little bit of cultural discussion about how the Air Force at the Pentagon level really thinks about their mission. You see, ever since the 30s, the U.S. Air Force has felt that conceptually they should be an independent branch that makes independent decisions separate from the other service branches, more especially the Army. And this was important because in the history of the Air Force, we must remember that it got its start as part of the Army as the U.S. Army Air Force. So this was the state of affairs during World War II, which meant that the U.S. Air Force, as we know it now, ultimately had to answer to the land-loving Army before doing any strategic interventions in World War II. The invention of the nuclear bomb and the need for the U.S. government to have a dedicated nuclear response agency to oppose the Soviet Union, who themselves had nuclear weapons, led to the Air Force being made its own service in 1948. And ever since then, the U.S. Air Force brass has been careful to make sure that their independence has been jealously guarded. So being an independent service branch with independent intellectual and command levels to act in the face of warfare, we have an airplane right here which is literally designed to defend ground troops. This presents a philosophical problem that has dogged the A-10 ever since it first went into service, because it's not fast. It travels at 400 knots top speed, generally 350 knots for cruising velocity. It's not quick. It doesn't go supersonic. It doesn't turn 9 Gs, and it doesn't necessarily shoot down other airplanes at high altitude. So this aircraft already deviates from the traditional fighter pilot model substantially. And then we add in the conceptual fact that ultimately this airplane's job is protecting a ground pounder soldier, right? Soldier, deployed airman, Marine, what have you, which is the conceptual antithesis of what the Air Force is supposed to stand for. In line with the intellectual pursuits of William Mitchell, Giulio Douhet of Italy, and Trenchnard of the United Kingdom, the idea here conceptually is that the Air Force is supposed to be its own service branch, and it acts independently of the Army to bomb strategic targets and therefore win the war by making the enemy surrender because their command and control centers or population centers or economic resources are all destroyed. This is the intellectual foundation of how the Air Force views itself as an agency. And here you have this airplane which is designed to help the Army, effectively, meaning the same people who held the Air Force back in the minds of the Air Force Command during World War II. So we have this intellectual allergy of this airplane, and the A-10 kind of represents this cultural problem because the Air Force brass hates it, but there's nothing else in the inventory that can do the job as good or better, especially for counterinsurgency and low-intensity conflicts, which are the majority of the United States military's current commitments at this point in time. So it's hard to argue with the utility of using an affordable, rugged, and reliable aircraft like this versus something like an F-35, where if it gets shot down doing a close air support run, you're out $120 million airplane when you roll in the cost of the ordnance on board, fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So why would you risk a $100 million airplane versus a $20 million airplane if you had a choice? So the A-10 has a useful strategic niche in that it is a useful close air support and tactical airplane for situations and conflicts where you really it doesn't make sense to risk a stealth airplane. If you need to take out, for example, ISIS oil rigs, or not ISIS oil rigs, but ISIS oil vehicles, because they're stealing oil to fund their campaign of terror and beheadings and whatnot and all that, do you use a $100 million stealth airplane to attack Toyotas, or do you use an airplane that costs literally 30% of that? So the A-10 has a viable strategic niche, and if you look at the numbers during the Gulf War, the A-10s destroyed nearly as much tactical targets by themselves as the rest of the deployed coalition tactical air forces combined during the first Iraq War in 1991. So if we just go off the numbers and we set aside the oorah-ness and the social media hype and the pros and cons and the F-35 fans throwing rocks, we see that the A-10 does have a viable, data-driven, and important role to contribute in the modern U.S. defense establishment. However, we are still left with that cultural problem of this being an air-to-ground airplane in an air force that sees itself as an air-to-air strategic initiatives agency. And this has even led to some pretty crazy things. In 2015, a two-star general named James Post accused airmen at a 300-person tactical symposium of being treasonous for advocating in defense of the A-10 to Congress. And now treason's a very strong word to use in general, but when a military member uses that to discuss another military member's conduct outside of the context of a court-martial trial, that's a pretty extreme statement to make, and it really goes to show you just how controversial the A-10's continued service is. The U.S. Air Force brass feels that pointy nose, high-speed strategic aircraft are the way to go with this sort of thing, and that the A-10 is an extravagance that we do not need. Others feel that the A-10 is a cost-effective solution to a lot of the problems that the Air Force has. And for what it's worth, I feel that if we set aside the polemics and we just look at the data, I think that the A-10 has more than proven itself as a viable combat airplane. And for the low cost it offers and the fact that it's viable for service up to the year 2050, does it really matter that so many people don't like it? I mean, when we're fighting a lot of counterinsurgency and low-intensity wars, and we have stealth airplanes that cost $60,000 a flight hour to operate, if we have something that does the job of air superiority, or in this case, close air support, for a fraction of that money, and it's in the inventory and it works, why not use it? That's just my logical perspective on this. So the A-10 first came into service in 1977, and it has been used in the intervention in Panama, Iraq in 1991 and 2003, Afghanistan, Libya, and is currently serving in Syria, as well as being forward deployed to Eastern Europe in response to Russian military events in that area. So there's also, I was interested to find out, one A-10 that is used for weather research. Apparently a conglomeration of schools, I believe it's the South Dakota School of Mines and Engineering, DARPA, and the U.S. Naval Observatory have parceled aside an A-10 to use for high altitude weather research. Apparently the logic there is that the armor of the A-10, meaning the 30 millimeter, the high density armor that is used in the titanium enhancements of that, allow it to fly in high hail environments, which would probably chew up and spit out any other airplane that's used, which is kind of an interesting approach. Usually, of course, we would apply armor to use against defending against, like, fired ammunition and machine guns and the like. But the A-10, is being used for weather research instead. At least that one is. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to discover about this aircraft. So with those points covered, let's move on to the model itself. This aircraft is I think it's nicely done on HobbyMaster's part. It looks really good compared to the Easy Model NAW2-seat A-10, which I recently just ordered. And that, to be fair, that the Easy Model A-10 is actually pretty good looking in its own right, but this is a really well detailed piece of kit. You've got the electronic jammer pod here, the rocket launcher, HA1324 Maverick there, and cluster bomb canister here, although that is also repeated on the other side, with 2 air-to-air missiles here for self-defense and a targeting pod here. And I believe the targeting pod, you can't see it in this shot, but the targeting pod is a sniper. There's also another AGM-65 there. The engines are nicely detailed. The General Electric fans are really well detailed here. And then, of course, the GAU 830mm Cannon of Doom. That is nicely detailed. The vent doors and the cockpit ladder area are all the doors here. They're really nicely done. Landing gear is pretty well detailed. A little bit of silver paint on the landing gear light probably would be useful here just to break up the whiteness of the setup, but that's not really a deal breaker. And the canopy can be positioned upward or downward based on your personal preference. You can just pop that up and show it there. Mine seems to be a little loose. Instead of hanging out right here, it tends to flop down a little bit unless I'm gentle, but you can display it with the cockpit up or down as you see fit. Let me know in the comment section, for those of you that own other HobbyMaster A-10s, if you have seen this issue happen where it just kind of flops over a little bit, or if it's supposed to do that. Again, this isn't necessarily a deal breaker of a flaw, but it is something to bear in mind if you're someone who happens to like displaying your airplanes with the canopy in the open position. It might be a good idea to put, maybe a little Scotch tape or maybe something underneath there to keep it up, because as you can see, it's really difficult to keep in a consistent position, and it just tends to kind of flop over. So as flaws go, I mean, it's not a deal breaker for me. I'll just display it with the cockpit closed. But if you're somebody who wants to display it with the cockpit open, just bear in mind that it may not stay in the upward position. So as flaws go, that's pretty much the only major one that I think would be of relevance. The A-10 is also a pretty sizable airplane. It's surprisingly big, which doesn't really strike you that way until you order it and you see it's got a really wide wingspan compared to just about everything else in the inventory. So that big old wing helps it carry a lot of stuff, but it also helps it turn really well, which I thought was kind of interesting because, as an aside, many people think that the A-10 is useless in air-to-air engagements, but in point of fact, it's actually pretty capable because it flies very slowly. You have this big wing right here, which is good for generating lift and turning really well at low air speeds and low altitudes, which is, of course, the A-10's bread and butter operating conditions. And more importantly, the A-10 has that ability to turn really well, and its engines have shrouds in the back right here. So with the shrouds, which are nicely modeled, and you can probably see in some of the close-ups earlier, the shrouds help keep the infrared signature down, which means getting an infrared lock on to an A-10 is very difficult, especially if you're in like a fast-moving F-16 or F-15 or similar jet. You have to get very close to the A-10 to get an infrared missile lock between the airplane and the ground clutter, and by that point, you're probably just doing a pass and go situation because the A-10 pilot can just turn his airplane really close and then force the faster fighter to overshoot. And when that happens, then you're looking at 2 AIM-9s here and a and the Gao 830mm, which if you can chew up ground vehicles, I'm pretty sure it would make short work of anything with wings in the sky. So there's actually a picture of an A-10 that has a training kill of an F-16 and an F-22 painted on the nose out there, which I thought really underscored the point. You know, if you jump down low, try to kill one of these, I suspect you probably better know what you're doing, because the A-10 at low altitude is actually a pretty hard airplane to kill. And if you start looking at modern missiles like the AIM-9X, I haven't seen anything that says that they're carrying the AIM-9X yet, but if they did, that would really make attacking an A-10 probably virtually impossible to do safely. If you tried to dive on one of these guys and did like a high-speed cannon pass, it's probably the only safe way you could kill an A-10, because they fly too close to the ground for infrared radar or radar missiles to lock on. Infrared is obviously not going to work too well until you're right on the airplane, if at all. And the A-10 has a 20 or 30mm cannon, and if they've got two AIM-9Xs, they can literally shoot the target from almost 180 degrees behind. So yeah, in air-to-air, the A-10 is actually a lot better of a platform than many people might realize. Obviously, that's not its primary mission, but if it gets jumped by a fourth or third generation fighter, it's more than capable of holding its own if need be. So with that, let's kind of talk a little bit more about the model here. The landing gear has really good tolerances. You can take them out and put them on without much of a fuss in terms of adding equipment or having to add glue to keep it on. The fuel filler is really nicely modeled. Some of the areas like the nose step and the colors are pretty well done too. The insignias are really nice. I think, and it is something that I'm kind of on the fence about. I think this plane would look really well if you had a little bit of gun smoke weathering in the front here. I think it would look absolutely badass with that, but I also understand why manufacturers wouldn't do that, because one man's idea of a really nicely done forward cannon gun smoke deal is another person's idea of overdone. If somebody wants to buy one of these models, manufacturers have to make them in a way that as many people as possible can buy them. And if you have a big amount of weathering in the front, you got a prospective customer and she wants to buy one of these, and she looks at the model and says, it's too dirty in the front. Well, you just lost a customer. So I'm still kind of on the fence about the idea of doing that, adding a little bit of gun smoke to the front here. I did that on my F100 in Vietnam colors, and it looks pretty darn cool in my opinion. But again, that comes back to a debate that I have had on the channel before, and I'll probably have it again, in that, should weathering be done by the factory or by the owner? I personally think it should be done by the owner, but again, this is an A-10, it's got that big cannon. Shouldn't they all have some gun smoke on them? That's just a thought. Leave your thoughts and question, your thoughts on that question in the comment section below. I'd like to hear your input on what you think about whether the A-10 should have, as a default, some gun smoke weathering on the front near the 30mm cannon, because I think it would look really cool. So at this point, the A-10 does not have a retirement date, and it is still planned to be in service until, in structural theory, they can fly up to 2050, potentially longer if the Air Force puts more money into making them last longer with structural enhancements and things of that sort. So with that, I will leave the video there. So thank you again for logging on, tuning in, and watching. Feel free to leave your inputs and feedback in the appropriate sections below. Thank you for watching.